10. The world outside flipped on its head, but inside the shuttle everything was normal. There was something to be said for gravity plating and negators that dampened the effects of a planet's natural pull on normal people. Evie had no doubt if either of those systems failed, every person in the ship would be dead, except perhaps Asterva. She still wasn't sure what to make of her, but at the moment it didn't matter. They were being pursued by no less than 36 Sisk vessels, though none had come close enough for her to identify which of the prominent crime families they belonged to. Often the families would soak up ships and personnel from other families, always in an unending tug of war for power, with the only currency being death. For a brief time she considered joining the planet's security like Runak, but realized she didn't want to be a cop for the rest of her life. She wanted to be a captain. "Coming up to port," Rivers said. Evie checked the indicator, saw their pursuers were coming a little too close to port, and she input a diving sequence she'd come up with back before she'd even joined the coalition. All those days piloting planetary shuttles hadn't been for nothing, after all. "Gramos, we'll hang back and see if we can't pull some of these guys off your tails," Jan said over the comm. "At least we have something to fight back with." "Understood, Captain. Thank you," Evie replied. "The systems are having trouble compensating," Rivers said, as the shuttle dove straight for the surface of the planet again. "You're pointing the wrong way," Box yelled from behind them. "Will you shut up and let them work?" Cass yelled back. "No, because I'm a pilot and I know about this stuff. All we need to do is get back out of the atmosphere. I don't see why we're—" An explosion cut him off, rocking the shuttle as the negators failed and everyone was jerked to the left side of the shuttle. Evie turned back to see Cass straining against his harness, while Talia was pressed back against the bulkhead. Asterva, however, hadn't moved, other than to position her feet in a way that braced her against the pole. She remained seated, with her hands folded in her lap. When Evie's eyes met hers, she smiled. "You're doing great," she whispered. Evie shook it off. She wasn't used to compliments by people she didn't know, especially people claiming to be her mother. And while she wanted to get to the bottom of this, a part of her said she should have just left the Athru back at the planet and run like crazy. "Maybe you should take over," Rivers said, holding on to the panel as the shuttle continued to careen toward the surface. "I can plot us a course back to the ship better than I can fly." Evie nodded, and River input a quick series of commands that flipped the controls on their stations. Evie now had full control. "Let's see how you bastards like this," she said, and pulled the shuttle up so it curved in an arc, blasting it back toward the bluish-green sky. The negators couldn't keep up, and the occupants of the shuttle were pulled back. Evie could even feel her chair start to give, but she pushed the thrusters harder, working to gain altitude as fast as possible. "Course plotted," Rivers said. Her mechanical fingers had extended longer than normal to give her additional access as she was pressed back into her seat. Evie checked their surroundings to see a few of the Sisk ships had managed to keep up with her, something she found curious. The mobs didn't employ hotshot pilots. They were often more interested in enforcers, couriers, or sociopaths, because often jobs for pilots paid better than the syndicates. That wasn't to say it was unheard of, though it was rare. She needed to try something. "Everyone, hang on," she said. "What do you think we've been trying to do back here?" Cass said, his voice full of panic. She grinned. It was fun seeing him squirm, especially when he was out of his element. She pulled the shuttle into a corkscrew, plowing up through the clouds as the world spun in a perfect circle outside the main window. Once she was sure she had it perfect, she banked right, still in the corkscrew, and skirted along the upper edge of the clouds, leveling the ship out. She'd pulled some serious G's on that maneuver, and only the best Sisk ship would be able to keep up. When she checked the indicators, she wasn't surprised to see one last ship still on their tail. The others were back there too, but much further behind. Evie sighed, tapping the comm. On one of the monitors to her left, the image of a man appeared. Evie shook her head. "What are you doing, Runak?" Somehow he'd gotten in with one of the syndicates. At least now she knew how they found out about her and the others. "I'm doing what is best for my planet. You never should have come back," he replied. There was vitriol in his voice that hadn't been there before. She wasn't sure if it was because one of his fellow officers was dead, or if he'd just been hiding well before.
I didn't have a choice. You could have let us go.
He shook his head.
Couldn't happen. The Athru made their directives very clear. They have the power to destroy worlds, Evie. What are a few human lives compared to the entire population of this planet?
We've got an Athru right here telling you different, Evie said, pointing behind her. From his vantage point, Runak wouldn't be able to see Asterva, but she was sure he knew who she was talking about.
Ah, that. Well, when the order comes from a traitor to the Athru cause, I'm not so inclined to listen, am I? You better watch it. Your vector is drifting.
A series of blasts to starboard caused Evie to jerk them back into position. She chanced to look back at Asterva, whose brow was down in confusion.
How does he know?
She asked.
I don't.
She put her finger to her lips instead of finishing.
Oh, do you mean how do I know she's not a true Athru and abandoned their cause long ago? Did you forget procedure, Evie?
There was a snarl, but also satisfaction in Runak's voice. Procedure? What was he talking about? She racked her brain. The only way he could know was if he'd heard. And the only way he could have heard was, fuck. She patted the back of one shoulder while keeping her other hand on the controls. Finding nothing, she switched to the other shoulder, finding a small black piece of cloth there. A monitor.
So you do remember. All CISC arrestees are automatically fitted with surveillance devices, so their testimony can be used to incriminate or exonerate them. Damn it.
She rubbed the piece of cloth between two fingers.
It's no use, Runak said. You can't destroy it. It's designed...
A metal hand reached over and plucked the cloth from Evie's hand and smashed it using the force of a hydraulic press. When Box opened his fingers again, little bits of the cloth fell away, fluttering to the floor.
Designed to do what now? Box asked.
Go suck on an afterburner.
Captain? Evie? He's closing on us, Rivers said.
If Runak had been thrown, it was only momentary.
It doesn't matter. We have a lock on you now. You can't escape here, not with an unarmed shuttle. And think of what the Athru will give us for finding and killing one of their traitors. They may even grant CISC amnesty forever.
That's not how my people operate, Asterva said over Evie's shoulder.
You should have let us go. Because when they come and you don't have us in custody, they will destroy the planet.
Evie, concentrating on the controls and getting back to Tempest, dropped the ship into the clouds again, angling at 110 degrees. It was the opening gambit of something she called the fisherman's knot, because once the full sequence was done, it was as if she traced a knot in the sky. And she was sure Runak would recognize it. Right on cue, he made the same bank into the clouds. But instead of continuing along the path, Evie immediately banked the ship to the left, throwing the passengers up against the bulkhead again. She knew the shuttle and its systems just weren't built for this kind of punishment, but she didn't have a choice. She dropped down again, just below the clouds, coming around to where Runak should come out, and sure enough, his ship emerged from the clouds right in front of them. She hit the accelerator and shoved the front end of the shuttle into one of its primary engine pods, causing it to partially shear off, exposing the guts inside. On her screen, Runak cursed in CISC and turned around to see what was happening behind him. Evie swung the shuttle out to the side like a weighted ball on a string, and once she was sure she had the proper apex, flung the shuttle back down so it plowed directly into the engine pod. The pod exploded, and the image of Runak inside his shuttle disappeared. Outside, as the pod lost power, the ship tried to compensate, but with only one engine, which Evie guessed had also been pushed to its limit, it just couldn't stay up. It began a slow decline toward the surface, and unless Runak ejected, he'd die in the crash. At least you didn't plow straight through him, Cass said. She hadn't heard him come up beside her, but he stared out at the descending ship, no doubt thinking about the first time he'd witnessed her piloting skills. Now I see where you get it. Dealing with assholes like this all day long. Evie grinned.
How bad is it?
We have some structural damage, but the engines are okay. If we can get to Tempest quickly, we'll be okay. Evie nodded and jerked the ship up through the clouds again. It was time to be done with this bullshit and get back to the ship. Never did she think she'd have to fire on and maybe kill one of her best childhood friends. Then again, everything else about her formative years had been a train wreck. Why not this too? They emerged from the clouds, only to find 4 more Sisk ships waiting for them. Of course, Evie said under her breath. She'd been so focused on Runak she'd forgotten the others were still pursuing them. All around them, the Space Wings were attempting to keep the other Sisk ships engaged, and were doing a good job of it. Everyone, hang on, again, she said. Without Runak, there wasn't much chance of the rest of them keeping up with her again. But damaging Runak's shuttle might have left them vulnerable. She wasn't even sure if the ship could get all the way back to space. Instead of slowing, Evie hit the accelerator again. She flipped the ship on its side and skirted between the 2 closest Sisk ships, scraping the ceiling of the shuttle against one of them. Holy shit, Bach said. Even I'm not that crazy. Where are the Space Wings? Evie asked. Jan and Blackfield are above us. Sea is to starboard, engaging 3 different hostiles, River replied. Evie leveled the ship back out again, and following River's pre-programmed course back to the ship, headed up again. Maybe without Runak on their ass, they might actually have a chance. We've got another contingent coming in, Jan said over the comm. It looks like a swarm. I'm not sure we can hold them off. The screen to Evie's left flickered back on, showing Runak's bloody face. Smoke filled his cabin. I guess it really is kill or be killed, huh, Evie? You left us no choice, she replied, though deep within, guilt had already formed into a hard rock. There was no way she'd make it back to Tempest if she tried to save him. And even though she reminded herself it was either him or her, she hated she couldn't come up with a better solution. Runak coughed. It won't matter. I put a call in to every syndicate ship on the planet. You're not leaving here alive. To be frank, you're more valuable to us dead. The words stung, and she cut the comm, the screen going black. The only thing that mattered now was getting back to the ship. Remind me again why we didn't outfit these things with weapons? She called over her shoulder. Yeah, I know. Cass sounded so sure of her ability to get them home safe. It was an added layer of pressure she didn't need. Gramos, we're going to try and open a hole for you, Jan said. Once you're through, get back to the ship and don't stop. Evie's heart fell. She knew what that meant, even if it had escaped everyone else's notice. Jan and the others would have to stay behind to allow the shuttle to return. She shut her eyes for a moment. Acknowledged, Captain, she replied. Wait a second, Cass said. What is she doing? He'd come up right between Evie and River's seats, a hand on each chair. What she has to, Evie replied. She just hoped all this was worth it. Could she really justify a service presence if they lost 3 more crew members? Perhaps Runak was right. Maybe she was more valuable dead. Just as she was about to raise the Space Wings again, the shuttle's indicators went off, telling her a massive object had just joined the fight. Holy! Cass craned his neck up. Above them, the gigantic form of Tempest herself came into view, blocking out Hamel and throwing them into shadow. It trained its weapons on each of the smaller Sisk ships, taking them each out with one shot. They scattered. How are they keeping the ship up in the atmosphere? Box asked. I have no idea, Cass replied. Evie didn't know either, but she wasn't wasting any time. They'd been thrown a lifeline, and she wasn't about to lose it. She punched the accelerator, and the shuttle blasted back to Tempest, along with all 3 Space Wings close on their heels. She lined the shuttle up with Bay 1 and drove the ship inside. She hit the comm. Clear. Before she even set the shuttle back down, the rumbles from the engines were audible in the small cabin. She parked the Gramos in the closest space, then turned to see Sisk falling away from them outside the bay opening. Somehow, she knew she'd never see the planet she'd grown up on again. And she took an extra second to watch as it became smaller and smaller in the distance, until the familiar green of the undercurrent took over, and it was gone. 11. This is why a Cathan doesn't leave the ship. Cass rolled his eyes as he stepped out of the shuttle, coming face to face with an agitated Commander Graydon. His face had turned a shade of red. Look, it was my prerogative. We had a situation down there. How did you manage to maneuver the ship into the atmosphere without crashing? Hank's face softened, his hard edges disappearing, almost as if they'd never been there to begin with. Cass's first impression of the man had been he was a classic hard-ass, a no-nonsense soldier who always got the job done but took no shit. The truth was a bit more complicated. Hank had proved himself to be a thoughtful, compassionate person, and Cass was sorry he'd underestimated the man when they'd first met. It was Samaya's idea. We saw them coming for you, and she worked with Zenfor and Tyler down in engineering to come up with a solution. By reversing the polarity on the— Wait a minute, Cass interrupted. Samaya? Worked with Zenfor? A knowing smile spread across Hank's face. She's not the kind to hold grudges. Most of us aren't. We know what has to be done, and we do it. He was referring to the civilians and crew who transferred over from what had remained of Starbase 5 when Tempest had first returned to Coalition space. While they were still in the process of integrating into the existing crew, they'd managed to solve a few problems already. I'm glad to hear it, Cass said. He wasn't sure he'd be so magnanimous in her position. After all, Zen did almost break the woman's back. Yeah, she just went— Hank's eyes went wide, and he stepped back, reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there. Cass turned to see Asterva emerge from the shuttle, Evie at her side, and Talia at her back. Cass appreciated Talia taking the extra precaution of keeping a weapon on her, even if she wasn't fast enough to use it. Commander, stand down, Cass said, anticipating Hank's reaction. I gave you plenty of warning. I have hoped you weren't serious, Hank replied. Evie stayed in step beside Asterva as she stepped off the shuttle and examined the bay, craning her neck to take in the high ceiling and the long walls. Cass noticed all activity in the bay had stopped to watch the alien. The maintenance workers, the supply technicians, even the flight controllers up in the big window overlooking both bays stared down at them. The security team Cass had requested stepped forward, ready to take over from Talia. Evie approached Cass and Hank. How do you want to handle this? She asked. Handle what? A psychotic alien killer on board? How about out the nearest airlock? Hank said under his breath. What happened to not holding grudges? Cass asked. Some things are unforgivable, he replied. Listen, Evie said, stepping forward into the larger man's shadow. This woman was not part of the invasion force. She doesn't want to kill humans. She belongs to a rogue faction. She's not like the other Athru. I don't mean any disrespect. But how do you know that? Hank asked. What proof has she provided? None, Asterva replied, still standing a few meters away. Based on the level of their voices, she shouldn't have been able to hear their shushed tones. I am here on a promise of trust. Evie turned back to Cass and Hank. She's going to need quarters. Commander, will you please arrange something with the quartermaster? Cass asked. He had locked eyes with Asterva, who seemed determined to make him blink first. He wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. I'll see to it, Hank replied. And let's keep most of the crew away from her for now. The last thing we need is an incident from someone who can't control their emotions. People have a right to be angry. Most of them lost everything at the hands of these people. That did cause Cass to break his gaze with Asterva. I mean, Hank corrected, her people. He squinted. What is that jewel in her head? I've never seen that before. Neither have we, Evie replied. But trust me, as soon as we've confirmed she is who she says she is, I'm getting some answers. What's our heading? Cass asked, checking his comm for the time and to make sure he hadn't missed any general alerts. I set us on a course in the direction of Beta Stromgren, out of Coalition space, at least for now. I figured the further away we were from Sisk, the better. Cass nodded. Good thinking. I'm willing to bet that Weasel sent out an alert telling the Athru exactly where we were. He paused, wincing at what he just said. He had to remember that had been one of Evie's childhood friends that she'd been forced to kill. Sorry. It's fine, she replied. He dug his own grave. He should have just let us leave. But what really concerns me is not only was he a security officer, but he was involved with one of the syndicates as well. That's a level of corruption Sisk hasn't seen in a long time. Back when I lived there was always a clean line between the two, never an overlap. An intergalactic war has far-reaching consequences, Hank replied, still staring at Asterva.
Excuse me, she said, leaning forward. Whenever you are finished, I'd like to take my medical exam, so you will stop treating me like some kind of diseased specimen. You're the disease?
Cass glanced around, looking for who in the bay might have yelled that. His bet was crewman Thorne, who was one of the transplants from Starbase 5. She stood off to the side with the rest of the maintenance workers. It was difficult to tell sometimes who said what in the bays, as all the walls echoed everything. But Cass was reasonably sure about this one. Still, he needed proof. Box?
Yeah, boss?
Box walked over, having been the last out of the shuttle behind Talia and River. Voice print analysis. Crewman Cassidy Thorne, he replied, then pointed at her. She's right there. Thanks. Commander? Make sure the crewman is written up and temporarily relieved of duty. Yes, sir, Hank replied, though Cass heard some hesitation in his voice. He turned back to Evie. Let's get this over with already. It was a quick trip down one level to 14 where sickbay was located. Cass was ready to be finished with his nonsense already, but they had to go through the proper procedure. He was 90% sure her test would come back as negative, and all of this would have been an elaborate hoax to get on board the ship and destroy her from the inside. Cass made sure to station guards at all 3 sickbay doors once they were inside. If there was any trouble, their orders were to not only destroy sickbay, but everyone in it as well. Even if that meant blowing all the hatches and ejecting that part of the hull away from the ship. But she hadn't given them any trouble so far, except for a sneer every now and again at Cass. Once they were all inside, Zack stepped forward, her eyes alight with interest. She lowered her head for a brief second, then addressed Asterva.
Thank you for coming here. I've been looking forward to examining one of your species ever since we found out about you.
Asterva took a step back.
This was supposed to be nothing more than a DNA test, not an examination.
Zax glanced between Cass and Evie until Box stepped in between them. Don't worry, Box said. We are sworn to do no harm. Perhaps we should begin with the blood sample, then move forward, if necessary. He looked at Zax, who nodded. Asterva, will you please hold out your left hand? One of Box's fingers had retracted away, revealing a sharp needle underneath. When Asterva reluctantly provided her hand, Box inserted the needle into the skin, drawing out a small sample of blood. A crimson ring remained where he'd taken the sample. He ejected the tiny tube from where it had been nestled in his finger and gave it to Zax, who, if Cass had to guess, might be impressed with the improvement in Box's bedside manner, though it was always difficult to judge a Yax-Inax's internal monologue based on their facial expressions. Skin is thicker than I would have anticipated. Box fell into his medical persona.
My people can insulate ourselves from extreme cold, Asterva said. Like an oven, we can regulate how much heat we lose and when.
How cold? Zax asked, feeding the tube into a small machine.
We can maintain our temperature even in space if necessary. It is a simple process of increasing the amount of fat stored between our skin levels. It acts as a barrier to whatever environment we might be in.
Did our people originate in space? Evie asked.
No. I know of species that have, but not ours.
To Cass, she seemed complacent, almost as if she were a teacher and Evie was her student, and she was happy answering whatever question popped into her mind. The fact she hadn't tried to attack them or escape yet at least gave him some hope. He turned to Zax.
Still processing, she said without looking up. This is some dense genetic material.
Would you be more comfortable over here on one of the beds? Box asked Asterva.
No.
Box left her alone while the security team behind her stayed vigilant. Cass had dismissed Talia to return to her duties and to check on Zenfor's progress. If she could rebuild most of this ship, She should have no problem creating a new type of pistol for them to use against the Athru.
Well, that confirms it, Zack said, turning to look at the group. The mitochondrial DNA is a 100% match. There's no doubt. She is your mother.
Asterva smiled, but Evie didn't. She wasn't doing anything other than staring at Zax.
Are you sure?
Evie asked.
There's no doubt. You have some unique DNA, Evelyn, but it only shows up if you look closely. After what the captain told me about what happened on the planet, I took a closer look at your medical files. The information is in there. It was just covered up well.
That would have been me, Asterva said.
For your own protection, she added, glancing at Evie. I didn't want everyone questioning your heritage. Had I not made certain adjustments, the issues would have showed up at your first pediatric checkup.
How do you know so much about us? Cass asked. You speak our language, you know about how we take care of children, and you have a suspicious amount of technical knowledge about humanity. She eyed him.
Not that you'd understand this, but I deliberate carefully on my decisions before taking action. I spent years studying humanity, understanding their culture, their rituals, what was important to them, and the worst parts of their past. Because only when you're informed can you make a valid decision.
Cass gritted his teeth. He didn't appreciate the insinuation he'd gone off half-cocked with no concern for the consequences of his actions. That's all he'd been thinking about. Even if he had been informed, even if Rutledge had clued him in on the whole plan, he never would have gone along with it. It just seemed wrong. But he wasn't about to stand here in the middle of sickbay and argue the point with a member of the race that was trying to wipe them out.
So, not only have you been studying me, but you've been studying us as well. All of us, Evie said.
Asterva nodded.
For a long time. I remained hidden, of course, but you could say humanity was my pastime.
Evie turned to Cass.
Well, she's proven she is who she says she is.
Cass cocked his head over his shoulder, talking out of the side of his mouth. Is there any chance you could be wrong? Zack shook her head.
If nothing else, she's telling the truth about being Evelyn's birth mother. At least as far as I understand it. Though I can't figure out how she and Evelyn's father were genetically compatible, or why Evelyn looks human when there are obvious physical differences between the species.
That was a question behind his understanding. His specialty was based on how machines worked, not humans. But none of what he'd heard made him warm to the idea of her being on board. He couldn't decide if that was because he'd made such a grievous error when he'd allowed Diamant to come on, or if there really was something else he couldn't put his finger on. Could all of this be little more than envy? Zax excused herself and walked behind the rest of them, engrossed in something on a personal screen. Now that she'd made the discovery, he supposed they could all breathe a little easier. But Cass was put off about her attitude. He figured she'd be as interested in obtaining answers from Asterva as Evie was. Cass stepped forward. I suppose we'll try this. Welcome to the USCS Tempest. We're happy to have you aboard. Her granite-like face didn't betray a hint of emotion, and if Cass squinted, he could almost believe she was a statue. We should schedule a debrief, Evie said. Yeah, Cass replied. Samaya might be a good fit. She had an easygoing manner and could keep her cool when other officers panicked. But she had 18 years of prejudice to move past first. It might be a good opportunity for her, or it could end up being a powder keg. Regardless of who he chose, it was bound to be a long and complex session. He might even assign 2 people to the job. He just hoped she had her daughter's best interest at heart beneath that hard gray skin. Everyone was too preoccupied with their newest addition to the crew that none of them saw Zax leave sickbay, a small vial enclosed in one hand. 12. Evie's mother. He never thought he'd see the day. From everything she told him, Her mother had been a mystery all her life, and now they knew why. Cass hoped she could finally get some answers. He really did. But in the meantime, he had a ship to run and a crew to protect. Not only that, but he had to protect Asterva from those on the ship who might have a grudge against the Athru and decide she would be the best person to help them purge that grudge. Crewman Thorn might have just been the beginning. Having Asterva aboard might be like throwing antimatter into a jar to see what would happen. Reej was the new head of internal security, overseeing all the potential onboard threats, while Talia still remained their tactical officer. Cass had essentially split the role in two, as it seemed too much for one person to handle while they were in the middle of a war. He'd never been in a full-blown war before. Sure, there had been skirmishes back when he'd been an officer, but nothing so dire to require structural changes to the chain of command. All of this meant guarding Asterva technically fell under Reej's authority. Though given her people's history with his, Cass decided it was best if he left Reej out of it. Thankfully, Hank had come to the same conclusion. Otherwise, Reej would have been there in the shuttle bay when they arrived. But if he couldn't take care of it, who could? There were few people on the ship who had the capacity, much less the desire, to spend their time in the presence of an Athru. There was really only one choice. "Box?" Cass asked. "Can I see you a moment?" Box was in the middle of studying Asterva's sample on the monitors, but looked up, his eyes blinking in curiosity. He followed Cass to the far side of the room. "I've never seen DNA like this before. As far as genetic instructions go, there's a lot in there." "Great," Cass said, not really paying attention. "Look, I need to assign you to watch over her, at least until I don't know when, but we can't have her roaming the ship unguarded." Box let out an audible sound like an exhausted sigh. "Do I look like a babysitter to you? I am a doctor, and... Wait a second. That means I have authority over you. I can have you relieved if I feel your judgment has been compromised." "Box," Cass warned. "You assign me to watch over her like some kind of nanny, and I'll make sure you're in here for mental degradation." "Listen to me," Cass said, his voice hushed. Though he knew it probably wouldn't do any good, he was sure Asterva could hear everything in the room. But that didn't mean Evie could. Did you see how fast she was down there on the planet? There are very few people on this ship that could counter someone that quickly, and you're one of them. If she decides she's done with all of us, or this does turn out to be an elaborate ruse, I need you there to give the rest of us some kind of warning." He placed his hands on his hips. "What makes you think I can stop her? You saw what Evie did to me back in that pyramid. I was lucky to get out of there alive." "Because you don't have to worry about not killing her like you did with Evie. If it comes down to us or her, it has to be us. We're the only chance our people have left." He glanced over to see Asterva staring at him, but she made no motion as to whether she had heard what he'd said or not. But he wasn't taking any chances. He was counting on her hearing. "Ugh," Box replied. "Fine. I don't know why I keep doing favors for you. It isn't like it gets me anywhere. And I still don't have my medal." He looked down at his chest. There was a small area indented in the shape of a typical Coalition medal for exceptional heroism in the face of danger. Cass hadn't even noticed it until Box stared at it. "I'm the temporary captain," Cass said. "Maybe I can take care of that for you, as a thank you." "You'd better. I don't put my life on the line for just anyone." He turned to the rest of the group, still huddled on the far side of sickbay. "Good news. I'll be accompanying you on your tour of the ship." Evie narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Because I'm knowledgeable, funny, and most important, charming," Box replied, walking over to them. "I can tell you more about the ship and the Coalition than you could ever imagine." "I really don't think that's necessary," Asterva began. "Oh, it's absolutely necessary," Box replied. "As I am the primary alien ambassador aboard this ship, it is my duty to ensure your comfort and ease while you travel with us." Evie hadn't taken her eyes off Cass. While Box pontificated further, she strode over to him. "What the hell are you doing?" "My job. Why?" "Primary alien ambassador?" Cass shrugged. "I didn't tell him to say that. He came up with it himself." Which, Cass had to admit, wasn't a bad fib, and Box was typically terrible at lying. Perhaps he was picking some things up. "Can I see you outside for a moment?" Evie asked. There was a glint of fire in her eyes, but Cass was determined to stay resolute. Given what had happened both on Sisk and to Evie back on the Athru planet, allowing an Athru free reign was unacceptable. Still, he followed her out into the corridor, his eyes in the back of her head, until the door closed behind them. "Is this really necessary?" "You tell me." "Even if she wasn't Athru, I make sure she had an escort. It's standard procedure." "These aren't standard times, and she's not a threat. She's my mother." Cass shook his head. "She can be both at the same time." Evie's face soured. "Maybe that's what you think, but I know better. She's not here to hurt us. She's here to help." She must have seen the look on Cass's face, because she continued, "Look, I do feel a strong connection with her, something I've never felt before, not even when I was back on that planet. I felt it before I knew we were related. It was like something pulling at my insides." "How do we know that's just not her trying to influence you, like Dagnya did?" She shook her head. "I don't think it works the same way. Dagnya was internal to me. Asterva is external. I don't think she can make me do anything I don't want to." "Are you willing to bet the lives of the entire crew on that assumption?" He was doing his best not to get angry, but she was being so obtuse. If this had been him, she would have seen it for what it was immediately, instead of trying to justify Asterva's presence on the ship, no matter how many red flags it threw up. "There's nothing to bet, because there's no risk," she replied. She took a deep breath. "I need you to trust me. I'm not under her spell, and my decisions haven't been compromised. There is something different about this one, and you owe me, for Diamant." That stung. He'd known at the time it was a bad idea to bring that zealot aboard, but they'd been so desperate, and there were few other choices. He'd done what he thought was right for the ship. "Evie, you're too close to this. You can't see what she's doing to you." "What? You mean because she's the person I've been searching for my entire life? You think just because we're related that I can't make an informed decision about who and what she is?" He stared at the ground. "I didn't say that." "You're right not to trust her," she continued. "I don't either. But I know in my heart of hearts she's not here to hurt us. Though she is holding something back, something big. And it's my plan to get close and stay close enough to learn whatever it is she doesn't want me to know." Cass glanced back up into her eyes. She was serious. "Back down on the planet, I thought you might have actually left with her," Cass admitted. "Would you?" She nodded. "Because discovering what she knows would be more important than whatever risk might be involved. I don't know if she's truly split from the other Athru or not, but with enough time I can find out. But it's going to be hard to do that with Box on top of us all the time." "I'll tell him to keep his distance." "But Evie, we must have someone as a barrier while she's on the ship. If not for her sake, then for the crew's. Thorn could be just the beginning. What if someone tries to go after her in the corridor? Box can disable and put them to sleep before they even get close." She pressed her lips into a line. "I hate to admit it, but you're right. I hadn't considered that. Damn." "Are you sure you can maintain your emotional distance from her? That you won't get drawn into whatever she's telling you and forget to see it from all angles?" Her eyes searched his. "You're going to have to trust me. You owe me that much, at least. As soon as I learn something, I'll share it. That way, we're both in the loop." She was right. He did owe her. He gave her a nod and a small smile. I guess all I can say is good luck.
Thanks, she replied. I think we're all going to need it.
He held her gaze for a moment. Hey, I'm sorry about what happened down there, with your home and your friend. She shook her head.
He obviously wasn't my friend. I saw very little of the boy I used to know. Time and desperation had corrupted him. Who knows, he might have been a member of the syndicate before the Athru came along.
Cass hadn't considered that. They'd already seen so many instances of disruption among the people of the Coalition that any extreme almost seemed normal now. He fully expected any other planets they visited to greet them with guns out and blazing. I think we need to head to Sill Space, he said, abruptly changing the subject. Ever since Asterva had mentioned something about how if they'd only had that Sill weapon, the Coalition might have stood a chance against the Athru, he'd been rolling it around in his mind. Did that mean the Sill could beat them? Prevent them from destroying any more planets or stars? He could only hope so.
That may be the only course of action left open to us. How do you think they'll respond when we show up on their doorstep again?
Evie asked. He couldn't say. All he knew was they couldn't stay in Coalition-held territory anymore, since the Athru had regular patrols. And staying in open space looking for a place to settle was no future either, because who was to say the Athru wouldn't expand their new empire after a few hundred years of rule? Or maybe even only a few decades. There was a good chance they'd already taken Sargan territory, but no way to know for sure. It was clear on the other side of Coalition space, seasons away at best speed. We'll just have to hope they're sympathetic. Maybe Zen can help us in that area.
Do you think she'd be willing, after abandoning them?
I don't know, but it's worth finding out. He turned to leave, but stopped himself. Good luck with your mom. I hope she has all the answers you're looking for.
Thanks, she said,
bringing the ponytail over her shoulder again.
We'll find out, one way or another.
13. When Cass reached the weapons bay, he was surprised to find it empty, with all the control stations shut off. Hadn't there been a team of people working in here when they'd left for the surface, working on a new type of weapon to help them fight off the Athru if they were ever in another hand-to-hand combat situation? Zal? Where is Zenfor? Cass asked after tapping his comm. I believe she's in her quarters, Zal replied, though she's scheduled to be on duty. I know she's on duty, Cass thought. I'm the one who put her there. Thanks. He tapped his comm again. Lieutenant Denna?
Yes, Captain?
You were on the engineering team assigned to design those new weapons, correct? Cass walked as he spoke, heading for the nearest hypervator. There was a slight hesitation in her voice.
Yes, sir.
What's the situation?
Oh, well, Zenfor dismissed us. She said she had everything under control. Though I'll be honest, we hadn't made much progress. She kept wanting to go back to the drawing board, redesign the casing from scratch. None of us wanted to argue.
No, it was better you didn't, Cass said, stepping into the hypervator to his left. It was empty inside. While he'd seen her temper mellow, if something was bothering Zenfor, it was better no one else confront her. At least not until he could get a better read of the situation. I'm assuming then the weapon isn't finished.
When she removed us from the team, she revoked our privileges. So I can't say for sure, but I don't think so. It didn't seem to be going very well.
This should have been a simple assignment. He wouldn't have given it to Zenfor at all, but he'd wanted her innovation to design something special, something that would be infallible. Did she say anything? Or was she acting weird at all?
Nothing that I would consider worth reporting, sir, but she did seem distracted.
Cass pinched the bridge of his nose. Thank you, Lieutenant. Will you please gather the original team members and begin working on the design again? I'd like to have it done as soon as possible.
Yes, sir. Shall I contact the consul again as well?
She sounded enthusiastic at the prospect of working on the problem again. Of course she did. All engineers loved figuring out puzzles. It was their defining characteristic. "No," Cass replied. "Leave her to me. Robot out." He turned off the comm and waited for the hypervator to take him up to level 6. He was not looking forward to confronting what might be on the other side of her door, but he had no choice. He stepped out of the hypervator and made his way down the corridor to her quarters. It had only been a few days since he'd done this once before, when escorting her to confinement over her altercation with Samaya. At the time, he'd been impressed with her ability to adapt and handle the accusation. It seemed like she'd managed to rein in her temper and see a situation for what it was. So, what was the problem? "Zen, it's Cass. May we speak?" he asked once he pushed the call button beside her door. There was no answer. "Zen?" "I'm busy," she said from the other side. It wasn't an admonishment, but it wasn't cheerful either. "Let me in," Cass said, his heart beating harder than normal. "If you must." The doors opened and Cass entered the darkened room. All around her quarters, Zenfor had spread schematics and engineering specifications, each one of them drastically different. Cass stepped over 2 just to get inside the door. In front of him, she was hunched over the desk in her room, working on yet another schematic, drawing it by hand on a large sheet of parchment. "Where did you get paper?" Cass asked. "I had them printed for me down in Resources," she replied without stopping. "It was my medium of choice as a child." "You had paper on Thesleia?" Cass never would have believed a civilization that purported to be 10,000 years more advanced than any other would use something as simple and fragile as paper in any capacity. On Earth, it was only used on rare and special occasions. Cass couldn't help but think of his maps stored away in his room. "It's a luxury," she replied. Cass decided to test the water. "Lieutenant Denna tells me you dismissed the team before the work was finished." "Lieutenant Denna and her colleagues were in the way." She scribbled on the paper faster, her back hunching even higher. "Does that mean you managed to finish once they were gone?" She didn't reply. The only noise in the room was the scratching of her instrument on the page. Cass couldn't see over her massive form, but based on how fast the instrument was moving, he couldn't help but think the entire page was black with markings. "Is there a reason for this interruption?" she finally asked. Cass wasn't sure he would get anywhere with a weapon design, so he decided to drop it. "Yes, I'm taking the ship back to Sill space, and we may need your assistance." The scribbling stopped. "Why?" "Our new guest has informed me Sill weapons potentially have the ability to stop her people. She insinuated—" Cass hesitated, not wanting to repeat her accusation. But he didn't have much choice. Had the Coalition been outfitted with Sill weapons at the time of attack, they might have been able to fend off the assault. "The Athru said this?" "Yes. And there's something else. She's Evie's biological mother." Zenfor turned in her seat. Her normally sparkling gray eyes were a shade darker, as if fatigue had set in the pupils themselves. "So that's why you allowed her to come aboard." "She wants to help us destroy the Athru, or at least that's what she says." Zenfor hunched back over her sheets. "As if it will do any good now. Perhaps she should have tried to help 18 years ago." "The point is," Cass continued, "if the Sill can help, I have an obligation to seek out that help." "They won't help. You already know this." Cass hadn't wanted to admit it to himself, but she was probably right. Seeking help from the Sill was the last act of a desperate man in an impossible situation. But what other choice did they have? Head for open space? Or take on the Athru alone? "We're out of options," he said, "even if it is pointless." "You will reach the border and be rebuked, if not destroyed. If they consider the Athru on board a threat, they could destroy any Coalition ships on site to contain that threat.
Heading for Syl space is suicide.
My hope was you would help us. Zenfor chuckled, an actual chuckle. He didn't think he'd ever heard one from her before.
You think they'll listen to me, an outcast? Someone who turned her back on Syl culture? Who broke our most basic tenets?
She turned all the way around in her chair to face him.
Having me aboard hurts your chances. It doesn't help them at all.
You must have contacts. Old friends? What about K4? Or anyone else on the crew of your old ship?
They will treat me as I am, a deserter. Someone who left the serenity of Syl culture to join the chaos of the Coalition. Make no mistake, they'll recognize this ship. They will know what I've done. It's unavoidable.
Cass tamped down his frustration. She was being intentionally negative. And if he played her game, she'd only drag him down with her. I don't know what's going on, but this is the only option open to us at the moment. And it's the only way we could potentially help Sester. She roared out of the chair, grabbing him by his lapels and slamming him into the wall, his feet a meter off the ground.
Don't you dare try to emotionally manipulate me into playing your game, she seethed. I am not some pawn you can move around at your whim.
He grabbed her thick wrists with both hands, holding himself in place while he tried to concentrate. The slam had knocked his head and his back against the bulkhead, and they both throbbed, his head more than his back. I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm telling you a fact. We can't get anywhere near Claxia Prime or Earth without help. Where else are we supposed to go to find that? Every Coalition world is too concerned with themselves, too walled off. She held his gaze for a few moments before releasing him, dropping Cass to the floor. His knees nearly went out from under him, but he managed to stay upright. Zenfor closed her eyes and took a deep breath in through her nose. When she opened them again, they were brighter, more like herself.
I'm having trouble reacclimating. There are so many crew members now, and so little space. Without Sester, things are harder.
I can understand that, Cass replied. If you have a better plan, I'd be happy to listen.
No. But
he could see the gears working behind her eyes.
I knew a few people who I used to see as less than patriotic. At the time, I wrote them off. But if they're still alive, perhaps they may assist us.
Great, Cass replied. He indicated the ground littered with paper. How was everything else coming?
If you want your weapon, leave me alone.
Cass could take a hint. Plus, his back and head ached all the way down. It might not be a bad idea to get Zax to check him out, especially after what happened with Samaya. Which brought up something else. You can't lose control like that again. If it had been anyone else but me. She nodded. And for the first time he thought he saw a semblance of regret coming from her. But it could have been a trick of the light. She kept it dark in her quarters, he assumed, because it reminded her of the blackness of her own ship.
It won't happen again. To anyone.
He hesitated to leave, sensing there was something else she wasn't sharing. But not sharing was what she did. It was difficult enough to get her to open up about non-personal topics, saying nothing of matters which she considered personal. And he wasn't about to interrogate her. He left without another word, intending to swing by sickbay just to make sure. Once Caspian was gone, Zenfor collapsed into her chair, feeling the anger drain out of her. She'd allowed herself to lose control and nearly killed Caspian in the process. She was supposed to be better than that. It had been years since she'd lost her temper. Even when she'd confronted the Geisen woman when she'd first come aboard, Zenfor had managed to keep her cool. The fact she'd accidentally fractured the woman's back was beside the point. What was wrong with her? She leaned over the desk, staring at the scribbling she'd done for the 70th revision of this pistol weapon, and she still wasn't happy with it. Was there a limit to how many different ways this weapon could be designed? She was sure she'd exhausted them all, and she was no closer to coming up with a final, workable design that could mimic Cass's original weapon. It wasn't a question of functionality. Building a projectile-based weapon was simplicity itself. No. It was building something that reflected her level of skill as a sill, something the humans had never seen before, something that would impress them, as the ship had done. Zenfor screamed out loud. Was that who she'd been reduced to? Someone who needed the approval of the humans to find meaning in her life? Was that really what was keeping her from creating something for them? The need for praise? Perhaps it was because no one in Sill society had ever considered anything she'd done extraordinary. Why would they? She performed a necessary function to the best of her ability. It hadn't even occurred to her she might be able to do something others would find impressive. Among these people, she was closer to a god. She'd given them the ability to travel distances they'd never imagined, technology centuries ahead of their time. In effect, she had become like the Klaxians. Perhaps that was why she and Sester got along so well. Had he seen that within her when she hadn't? "I am a fool," she said aloud. Sester had figured her out before she'd even known there was anything to figure out. And then he'd left her, despite saying he didn't want to. She needed his guidance, his wisdom, and his solace to navigate this ship. She'd been able to manage when there weren't so many people around. But now that the crew was whole again, she was having a harder time adjusting. Last time, when she'd first come on board, he had been there for her, even if she hadn't quite realized it. And she had become dependent on him, on his presence in her life. But once he found out what happened to Klaxia Prime, he just curled up and... She wanted to say died, since that's effectively what he did. But it wasn't accurate. The fact was, part of her hated him for his selfishness in leaving her like that, after promising to be there for her. If she could stand being away from her own people, then he should have been able to stand it as well, no matter what happened on his home world. But he hadn't. And now she had no one. She thought back to Caspian's request. Of all people, he should understand negotiating with a Sill would be questionable, if not completely impossible, especially after what she had done. Perhaps if it was another ship, or there was evidence of her death, there might be a chance. But the Sill would give her no opportunity to explain. And she didn't want to. She had long ago decided they were too close-minded, and she had broken free of those restraints. They would never accept her point of view. No, they would consider it weak. They would tell her she chose the wrong side. And if she needed proof, just to look at the evidence. The Sill had remained strong, while the coalition had fallen. And the Sill would say they deserved it. They were inferior, and everyone would go back to life as normal, as if the loss of everything the coalition had accomplished meant nothing. Zenfor turned back to the myriad of designs strewn over the floor. She picked up the one closest to her and re-examined it. She grabbed both sides of the paper and ripped it in half, the sound like music to her ears. When she was done, there wasn't a regular-sized piece of paper left in her room. 14. So, Evie tried to fill the silence while she walked alongside Asterva. We haven't really had an opportunity to talk. 10 meters behind her, Box trudged along, dragging his feet. He didn't want to be with them any more than Evie wanted him there. No, we haven't, Asterva said. Tell me more about what happened after you returned to the ship. Marshall's memories only lasted as long as he was alive. Once he died, so did any further record. Evie tried not to think about Marshall's face. though it hadn't been the face she'd seen when she attacked him. She'd seen what she thought was the face of an enemy, one of the Athru that had rushed her, except it was just an illusion generated by Dagnya. There had only been 2 Athru out there, and still Marshall had died from the wounds inflicted at Evie's hand. She was responsible for so much death, it made her want to throw up. I woke up, and that thing was still inside me. Only it took me a while to remember. They blocked out my memories of her to protect me. Interesting, Asterva said, her voice even and not showing any outward reaction to the news. Tell me more. I'd like to hear about how you and the other part of yourself interacted. Evie had been waiting all her life to meet this woman, and all she wanted to talk about was the past week? No, we need to start at the beginning, the very beginning. How did you meet my father, and where did I come from? Asterva sighed. I don't think that's too much to ask for, considering how long I've been waiting for this. I suppose not, Asterva replied, though I wish we could have some more privacy. She glanced behind her. You should retake your rightful position as the captain of the ship. Then you could make whatever policy you wished. Evie shook her head. I've lost the trust of the crew, and for good reason. This will have to do. As if to underscore the point, a passing crew member didn't even look at Evie, though she threw a surprised glance toward Asterva. Very well. First, you must understand, me, and others like me, have always worked in secret. And we come from a long line of individuals upset with the status quo of the Athru. We never believed in the destruction of humanity. Wait a second, Evie said. How long have you known about us? We've known about humanity for a very long time. Finding you, however, took considerable resources. But the point is, the ship I served on was crewed entirely by people like myself, who never had any ill will toward humanity at all. We were more interested in finding and studying you. Why? Evie asked. Imagine being told about something forbidden from the day you were young. This obscure thing is, and has always been, out of reach. You're told it is evil, undeserving, rife with corruption, and to be destroyed if ever encountered. Wouldn't that pique your interest? Evie shrugged. I can't argue with you there. She couldn't help but think about the spaceborne creature that had almost destroyed the ship. In that case, they had been so interested they hadn't seen the danger it presented. It had almost cost them the lives of everyone on board. But there had been part of her that wanted to understand the creature, to learn more about it. 33 of your years ago, we were on a survey mission. Wait, allow me to amend that. It was classified as a survey mission, but we all knew what the true purpose was. The only reason the Athru engaged in survey missions was to find inferior species. Once found, a new species was either subjugated and stripped of any useful information, or they were destroyed. That seemed overly harsh and unnecessary. What was it with this culture? Even the Sill didn't go to such extremes. Why? My people believe they are the ultimate life form in this universe, and anything that flies in the face of that viewpoint needs to be eliminated. More often than not, it's the former. In the rare case they encounter a superior force, that force is often given a wide berth. Asterva cast her eyes down as she spoke. If she were human, Evie would say she was ashamed. My ship detected a nearby vessel, and we modified our course to investigate. As you've probably guessed, we encountered the USCS Austin. My father's ship. Yes. I didn't know it at the time, but he was an officer on the ship. Because we can shroud ourselves, they couldn't detect us. We managed to shadow the ship for months.
You measure time by months? Evie asked. Of course. It's more accurate than using seasons. I'm not sure how the Coalition got into that habit. She paused, furrowing her brow. Anyway, there was a great debate on board my ship about how to proceed. No one wanted to report the finding back to our peers, as we knew the directive would come down that we would shadow the ship until we found where it had come from, then destroy it. Wait, Evie said. I thought you said you already knew about humans. How could you know about them if you'd never encountered any? They turned the corner into another corridor heading toward the aft of the ship. We had found evidence of human activity on other, older worlds. Old ships, computers. But nothing that told us more than that. We didn't know where you were. But you managed to find Coalition space. You found the Austin. Asterva shook her head. No, we didn't. We didn't know it at the time, but the Austin was far outside Coalition space, past what you know as Epsilon Lyre. They were a good 2 months from Coalition territory. What? Evie asked. That didn't make sense. She'd gone over all the Coalition records on her father's old ship. Nothing had ever mentioned a deep space mission. Asterva caught her eye. What did you think they were doing when the ship was destroyed? Evie stumbled for an answer. Now that she thought about it, everything about the Austin's mission itself had been vague. She'd been so focused on finding the who, she hadn't paid much attention to anything else. I'm not sure. I guess I assumed it was a survey mission or exploration. The Austin was a research ship, but the report did say it succumbed to an unknown space anomaly near Kretak, at the border, not 200 light-years away. The surviving crew ejected into escape pods and spent over a year drifting toward the closest planetary system until they were eventually found and picked up. Up until I learned about you, I had always figured I'd been conceived in a tiny escape pod. Asterva took a deep breath. Very little of that is actually true. I don't believe they spent more than a few days in the escape pods, to say nothing of a year. Evie tried to comprehend. But the records, we modified those. It was part of a well-crafted ruse to obscure our existence. Obscure their existence? Evie stopped in the middle of the hall. Asterva continued for a few paces, then stopped as well, turning to her. Behind them, Box had stopped as well, though closer. Evie finally realized the wisdom in having him here. He could corroborate anything she learned from Asterva, and he'd keep recordings of it as well. If everything she knew about her father's mission was false, well, it wasn't as if she could bring a case against the Coalition itself, but at least she could set the record straight, even if the people on Tempest were the only ones who ever knew. Your father's ship was returning from negotiations with a species known as the Hydra Lagul. They were a paranoid xenophobic race the Athru wiped out years ago. But what the crew of the Austin didn't know was the Hydra Lagul had planted explosives on their ship while they operated under the guise of diplomatic negotiations. We detected the problem only moments before the ship exploded. Had it not been for my ship being there, all hands would have been lost. I've never even heard of the Hydra Lagul, Evie said. From my understanding, for a time every ship that entered their system was destroyed. Your Coalition worked long and hard to build a peace with them, to at least prevent a war, or that's what they thought they were doing. Evie couldn't believe it. Had the Coalition Council even known? And how had she never found even a mention of this in any records? Was this just another one of the Coalition's clandestine missions, outside the normal range of operations? Like Cass's mission with the Sill? At least in this case, the goal had been peace, even if it had been unsuccessful. She turned to Box, no longer pretending like he couldn't hear them.
Do you have any record of this in anything you've downloaded? No. If what she says is true, it was buried deep. She might be lying. His eyes blinked twice. Keep going, Evie said. Box was right. All of this could be a fabrication, especially since there were no records to back it up. But she was reserving judgment until she'd heard the entire story. Asterva had been staring at Box, but returned her attention to Evie. We managed to save 12 of them, your father included. We brought them aboard, tended to their injuries, and woke them back up. There were only 9 of us, but we decided the risk was worth it, especially knowing how bad the primary Athru line wanted them destroyed. We wanted to find out just what was so special about these humans that made them a target. Osborn was the first we met. Evie bit back a retort about how it must have been an explosive first contact if Osborn had been humanity's ambassador, knowing his attitude toward people. Instead, she motioned for Asterva to continue. I liked him. He was gentle, possessing a soul that saw the world differently. He wasn't like any of the others, at least not to me. Her eyes had gone wistful, as if she were remembering a pleasant dream. Evie couldn't help herself. Are we talking about the same man here? Osborn Diazol? She was thrown back to her last encounter with him, when he'd accused her mother of killing herself because she couldn't handle Evie, when he'd attacked her and Cass had to knock him off because he was so strong. That was when Evie had first learned about a woman named Amanda, who hadn't been her mother after all. But he'd said something about a promise. The same, Asterva said, oblivious to the storm raging in Evie's brain. We don't have artists in our society. So, to meet a painter and to watch him work, it was new and exciting. None of us could understand the reasoning behind the Athru's desire to destroy these people. We allowed them to stay on our ship, and your father and I became close. Excuse me, as a doctor, I have to interject, Box said. How did you overcome the genetic incompatibilities during copulation? Do the Athru even have genitals? And if so, what are their shape and size? Were there any additional tools necessary in the process? And if so, how were they used? Box, Evie said, that's not an appropriate line. No, he's quite right, Asterva said, and it is relevant. Osborn and I discussed the possibility of coupling before we ever understood the act. Creating a hybrid life form was not only of interest to us as researchers, but we wanted to push the bounds of what we thought might be possible. It was as if Evie had been slapped. So that's all I was, a scientific curiosity. She should have known as much, knowing her father. No, we wanted a child. And we wanted each other's child. But we weren't even sure it was possible. I worked with a geneticist on my ship to determine how we could proceed, and we developed a range of techniques to make the union possible. She turned to Box. No additional tools were needed. Our genitalia are similar to humans. Box's eyes blinked in rapid succession. That is fascinating, Evie. Can you imagine the odds of similar genitalia in 2 species opposite of each other? Think about how they must have developed. I must get a record. He moved toward Asterva. Nope, Evie said, holding Box back. Not out here in the corridor. Now is not the time. Understood? But Evie, my database. Think of what this could mean to my research. She ignored him. You used genetic manipulation to create me. Asterva nodded. We had to. All our projections said a fetus wouldn't survive otherwise. Were there any others like me? Any other humans who mated with Athru? She'd been thinking about the possibility of others like her ever since Asterva had mentioned the 12 survivors. At least that much was accurate. Knowing they had all been on the Athru ship for an extended period of time meant her case might not be unique. No.
No one else experienced the attraction Osborne and I shared, though we all exchanged ideas and information. It was where most of my knowledge of your culture comes from."
Evie dropped her shoulders. Not that she needed someone else to be like her, but it would have been nice not to feel so alone. But then again, if anyone else had that Athru personality inside them, it would have come out long ago.
"And then, once your embryo was viable, you were cultivated and born in only 7 weeks." "7 weeks?" Evie asked. "How is that possible?" "We have advanced techniques that speed the rate of development. The entire ship was involved in creating you. And your father and I stayed in the lab every day while—" "Wait. I was grown in a lab?" "All Athru children are," Asterva replied. "Didn't I mention? It's deadly for an Athru female to give birth naturally."
She looked from Evie to Box, then back again, as if they were being intentionally obtuse.
"An unfortunate side effect of our species. The process kills us."
15. In the command room, Cass stared out at the starfield beyond, tinged green from the undercurrent as it flew by. Sachs had given him a clean bill of health, saying he'd be bruised, but with no lasting damage. But she'd seemed distracted the entire time. He'd considered asking what was up, but if he was being honest, he didn't have the headspace for it. Cass was more concerned about Asterva and her presence on the ship. Not to mention he'd been waiting over an hour for an update from Box and had heard nothing. He could only hope the Sill could offer a solution, or at least an avenue toward one. Maybe they didn't have to help him so much as they needed to point him in the right direction. Because Zenfor was right. If they hadn't been willing to help the Coalition when it was at its strongest, why would they now? For the first time, he finally felt the weight of command pressing down on him, and he tried to remember what it was like back before life had become so stressful. Hadn't this been what he wanted? Because what was the alternative? Ferrying rich people across star systems in Sargan territory? Though he doubted if there were any couriers left after the Athru had come through. They'd never said they were specifically after the Coalition. No, it had been humanity. And a great many humans lived in the Sargan Commonwealth. Hell, it had been founded by humans 1,000 years ago. Those who had been upset with the way the Coalition ran things, at all the corruption. And it had taken him a while to catch on. But when Cass finally had, he saw what all those people had been talking about. But instead of uniting in their efforts and putting them towards something good, the Sargans had decided to live by their own rules, except for one: me first. You had to assume every person you encountered in the Commonwealth was looking out for number one, and number one only. If you went in with that mindset, you'd be fine. Compassion was seen as weak, which was why it was probably good Cass had gotten out when he did. Word would have spread that he spared Maddox's life again, and Vina would probably have taken him off his ship and dropped him on a planet somewhere. So, in a way, Evie showing up when she did was a blessing. There was no comparison. He never wanted to go back to that life or anything resembling it. He was home here on this ship and with these people. It was a difficult thing to admit, but even after they'd excised him, he'd always wanted to return, no matter what he told himself over a stiff drink at the bar. This had always been the ultimate destination, and against all odds, he'd made it back. And now that he was captain, it was time to prove himself, just like he always said he would. Cass tapped his comm. "Box, status update. Where are you?" "In the corridor on level 5, but I can't talk now. I just learned some juicy gossip." He ended the call. Cass shook his head and tapped his comm again. "Box, stop fucking around. What's happening?" "I'm trying to find out. Just give me a few minutes. Oh, and by the way, they're coming to see the bridge in a few minutes, so FYI. He ended the call again. "God damn it," Cass said, reaching for his comm a third time. But before he could tap it, The chime of the command room door sounded. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Samaya and Hank, both with grave faces glowering at him. "What is it? What happened?" Cass asked, his pulse quickening.
"May we speak freely, Captain?"
Samaya asked. He couldn't believe she was asking that of him. Even though he'd been her commanding officer back at the Atlas, they'd always been open and honest with each other. Cass had at the time seen her as a kindred spirit. And now that she was almost 2 decades older than he was, he couldn't help but feel like she had transformed into a mentor. "You can always speak your mind to me, Samaya. You know that." She glanced at the floor. "I didn't want to overstep my bounds, not with all the changes we've had to deal with over the past few days. I'm still getting used to being aboard a functioning ship. I accidentally took the service corridor down to 11 yesterday, and didn't realize the hypervators hadn't been destroyed until I was halfway down." "I've done something similar," Cass said, remembering how disoriented he was as soon as he came back aboard the newly repaired Tempest. And he'd only been gone a day in his own time. Samaya had 18 years to get used to doing things the hard way. "Captain, we need to discuss this Athru situation," Hank said, his voice hard, like it had been when Cass first met him. "The commander and I have spoken, and we believe bringing her on board is an error." Cass glanced at Samaya, who nodded. So much for his ideal person to debrief her.
"What if she's here as a spy to ascertain our capabilities? There's still so much about them we don't know."
"I had a similar thought," Cass said, "but the medical test proved out. She's Evie's mother." "Which means nothing," Hank replied. "For all we know, the Athru could eat their children. This might just be her way of infiltrating to take down the last coalition ship in existence." Cass huffed. They didn't know Tempest was the last coalition ship, but he'd had his suspicions. The Athru would have long ago taken care of any others that hadn't left for open space. Either that, or commandeered them to do with as they pleased. Some, he supposed, had been retained by some of the former coalition members, like the Untu, who used them to patrol their planet. But once they became the property of a particular planet or system, they ceased being coalition ships, and instead became mercenary vessels. There was no more fleet. "I hear your concerns, I really do. I had them myself. But the fact is, we are lost without some way forward. And this woman can potentially expose weaknesses the Athru might have. She's already told us SIL weapons would be effective against them. I think that's a good place to start."
"And if it turns out she's lying, and we're headed for a trap?" Samaya asked.
"I don't know. But there's not a lot else we can do. I've tried to take every precaution." Without warning, the whole room shook, and Cass had to grab the side of the table to keep from toppling over. Samaya buckled, but Hank was there to grab her before she went down. He'd braced himself immediately, almost as if he knew what to expect. "Report," Cass yelled into the comm.
"One Athru ship. It just came out of its time bubble and is in pursuit," Talia said. "The undercurrent drive is down."
"Damn it," Cass said, looking at Samaya and Hank. "Not a word. Take your stations." They both nodded, and Cass followed them out onto the bridge. "Where did it come from?" Cass asked. Talia checked her screens.
"Heading 905, Mark 20. 1 minute it was there, the next it wasn't. I don't know if it was lying in wait, or just a random ship on patrol we happened to hit."
"I assume we're still running with the armor up?" Cass asked.
"Yes, sir. Commander Graydon told me not to drop it for any reason."
Cass nodded. "Good thinking, Commander. Zal, send out a ship-wide alert. Everyone to their battle stations." "Aye," Zal said. "Rond, what's our heading?" Cass asked. "Still on course for the nearest edge of SIL space," he replied. "But even at our current speed, we're over a week away." "Switch it up," Cass replied, "and get us out of Coalition space as soon as you can. I'm sure they'll chase us to the Kretos Nebula and back, but my bet is there aren't as many of them out there as there are in here." "Yes, sir," Rond replied, nodding to River, who plotted a new course. It showed on the main screen along with the relative positions of Tempest and the Athru ship. "All stations are reporting battle ready, Captain," Zal said. "Good. Do we have anything that will make a dent in that chip? The screen in front of them veered wildly as energy blasts shot past them. Sorry, Ron said. Just trying to keep us out of their line of fire. All we have is the transdimensional weapon, Talia said. It's the only thing that stopped them so far. You can't use that, Samaya said. Any species in this region of space will be cut off from any faster-than-light travel for centuries. They needed another option, something that wouldn't tear apart the fabric of space-time. Give me something else, Ensign. There is nothing else. We don't have weapons that can penetrate their shields. Our only hope is to tear a hole in space and hope we don't get caught up in the shockwave pulling everything in. They're gone, Rivers said. Disappeared from the screens. Cass looked up. The screen flashed a proximity warning. Hang on, Ron said, banking starboard. Cass felt the pull of gravity as the negators strained to keep their molecules together. They just came out of nowhere. Is it possible that's a second ship? Hank asked. No, sir. Same markings as the first. They must have entered their bubble, then re-emerged to catch us off guard. Cass barely heard the hypervator doors open behind him. He was too focused on figuring out a strategy that didn't involve destroying space as they knew it. If we could just get back into the undercurrent, he said. Cass to Tyler. How long will it take you to fire up the drive again? 2 minutes. It only requires a minor adjustment, Captain. 2 minutes. That could be an eternity in a firefight, especially one where they didn't have anything to defend themselves with. Rond, keep up the evasive maneuvers. Talia, throw everything you've got at them, even if it doesn't make a dent. We need to make sure we're out of options. Out of the corner of his eye, Cass caught the flash of light on metal. He turned to see Box standing with both Evie and Asterva watching the action. He kept his curses to himself, but turned to see Hank had locked eyes with Asterva. Commander, Cass whispered, not now. Hank stood, addressing the Athru. You want to help? Tell us how to defeat that ship out there. Your best bet is to run away. Your weapons won't be effective against them, she replied. And how are we supposed to survive the next 2 minutes without a way to defend ourselves? He demanded. Ensign, how much more can the armor take? Cass asked. Another hit, maybe 2, Talia replied. If it weren't for Zenfor's upgrades, we'd be space dust already. Cass looked to Evie for any help, but she shook her head. Their fate was in Ron's hands. What if we used the shuttle as a mine? Samaya asked. Loaded it with explosives and dropped it out of the bay. We could even program it to head for the Athru ship. They're not stupid, Asterva said. They detect what was aboard and throw it right back at you. As I said, your only chance is to run. With this ship's speed, you can outpace them. Mr. Rond, it's up to you, Cass said. If you can hold them off for another minute or so. Yes, sir. He hunched over his control panel. Outside, space swung wildly from one side to the other. Blasts of purple and red flew past the ship, and each time Cass thought it would be the one to end it all. He turned to Asterva again, who seemed as calm as someone on vacation, as if all their lives were in danger. Captain, Tyler said over the comm, bad news. Zenfor's advanced drive was damaged when we came out of the undercurrent. We can re-enter at normal speed, but the drive won't be fixed for a while. How long's a while? Cass asked. The situation was spiraling fast. Maybe 3 hours. She's down here now working on it. Cass glanced at Evie, who had just gone a shade paler. To their credit, the rest of the bridge crew didn't miss a step. But there was no way they could do this for 3 more minutes, much less 3 more hours. Cass was back down to his original choice. Ensign, load the transdimensional weapon. 16. You can't. Asterva had lost all her previous composure. Panic now colored her alien face as she stepped forward. Cass tried not to let his surprise at seeing her outburst show. It's either that, or we die. You said yourself a SIL weapon would be effective. We've done this before. We know it works. You've done this before? She was almost screaming. Beside her were the only two people who might be able to restrain her if she decided to try something. But it didn't give Cass much reassurance.
"The weapon is ready, Captain," Talia said.
"As soon as you have a lock, fire," Cap tapped his comm. "Tyler, we need that undercurrent right now."
"I'm coordinating with him," Samaya added. "The standard undercurrent is ready."
Cass nodded.
"You fools! You don't understand what you're about."
Before Asterva could finish, Talia fired the weapon at the Athru ship. It struck it dead center, creating a bright flash of light, which the monitor automatically dimmed. When it returned to full luminosity, it looked as if the ship was being pulled within itself, while what Cass could only describe as an electrical storm erupted around the impact point. "Hit it!" Cass yelled. Samaya activated the controls on her station, and the ship slipped into the undercurrent easily, leaving the Athru ship to disintegrate by itself. But before the ship disappeared off the screens, Cass could have sworn he saw a black tentacle made up of what he could only describe as darkness wrap itself around what remained of the ship. He turned to Hank. "Did you see that?" Hank frowned. "See what?" Cass turned to Evie, whose eyes had gone wide. He glanced over to Zal, but since his facial range was limited, Cass couldn't tell if he'd recognized it or not. "Zal, tell me you got a scan of that." "I did, Captain," Zal replied. "It matches the description of the creature we encountered at the XL Nebula." "Son of a bitch," Cass uttered under his breath. Had that happened when they'd used the transdimensional weapon back at Starbase 5? Was this how these creatures manifested themselves in their universe?
"I told you not to use it," Asterva said. "And now you've opened something that is very difficult to close."
Cass turned to her. "We've closed one before. I don't see why we couldn't come back and close this one, too."
"Because,"
Asterva said, hatred in her voice,
"they're interconnected. The more holes you rip in space, the stronger the creatures become. The Athru once encountered an entire region full of them, where the barriers between dimensions had become so thin, thousands of the creatures had come through to feast on this universe. We did what we could, but even our weapons were only mildly effective against them. We barely managed to contain them."
Cass slumped back in his seat. They'd sealed the fissure at the XL Nebula, but they may have just contributed to two more, both within Coalition space. And if others were using transdimensional weapons, such as the Sill, or perhaps even some desperate individuals from the Sargan Commonwealth, they might have a real problem.
"You have no business as the captain of the ship," Asterva said. "Your decisions are reckless, and you don't consider the consequences before you take action. How you ever became a captain is beyond me." "Mother, please," Evie pleaded. "Cass has all the necessary training as well as the experience to captain the ship. None of us knew about the fissures. I wouldn't trust anyone else with the safety of this crew."
Hank walked up to Asterva. "Did you just threaten the captain?" Samaya stood to join him, and Cass shook his head. She didn't need to add any more flame to this fire.
"And if I did? For all I know, you would be better equipped to lead this group."
Asterva looked like she might pounce out of her robes and begin attacking the crew at random. Cass needed to find a way to defuse this situation.
"Your captain just tore a massive hole in the fabric of space and time. What gives him the right to do that? Even the Athru aren't so reckless. If all humans were like him, I would understand why my people were so adamant about destroying yours."
"Yeah?" Hank challenged, matching her tone and outrage. "It's convenient how that Athru ship just happened to find us moving through space. And they happened to knock out our undercurrent drive, so we'd be forced to face them in a fight." He surveyed the rest of the bridge crew. No one said anything, though Cass was about to speak up when he continued. "What did they promise you for getting aboard our ship? What do the Athru cherish?" Asterva showed her teeth.
"I am not a spy. I am here for my daughter, and to help save what is left of humanity."
"I think you're here to destroy what's left of humanity," Hank said, stepping closer. That's enough, Cass said, squeezing between Hank and Asterva, which was no easy feat since both of them were larger than he was. We're not doing this. Evie, take your mother off the bridge. We need to regroup and help fix Zenfor's advanced drive.
She should be locked up, Samaya said, until we can determine she didn't give away our position. Is it possible the Athru managed to detect one of their own aboard, and that's how they found us? Talia asked.
Samaya shook her head.
The technology we used on Starbase 5 that keeps Ms. Diazol shielded from the Athru works the same for this woman. They can't detect her on board, not unless she sends them a signal.
How dare you, Asterva said.
I am here to help you, and all you can do is accuse me.
Cass wasn't sure what to do. Every time Asterva accused him of making a poor decision, it took him back to that moment on the bridge of the Atlas when he stood up against Rutledge and put his ship and crew in danger. What if she was right? Back then, he'd always just assumed he'd make captain one day, that the qualities inherent in a captain were ingrained within him. But perhaps that wasn't the case. Maybe he'd never been captain material to begin with, and it had all been a fantasy. Though at the same time, he couldn't ignore Hank's claims. It was possible they just happened to come across an Athru patrol ship, and then again, it was possible the aliens had been lured to them by Evie's mother. Box, did you see or detect anything that might have given away our position? Cass asked. He shook his head. Nothing that I saw. Unfortunately, what remains under the robe is a mystery to me. Cass addressed Asterva. Would you be willing to submit to a search so we can eliminate the possibility you may have contacted your people? All emotion seemed to leave Asterva's face.
No, you may not. I have already told you I did not contact them. That will have to be enough. Your distrustful nature will be what gets all of you killed. I found a healthy level of distrust is good for survival, Samaya said. She turned to Cass. If she's not willing to submit to a search, we don't have a choice. We need to confine her until we can figure this out.
Cass tried to tell himself Samaya was being impartial, that she would have suggested the same course for anyone else. But he couldn't quite make himself believe it. She and Hank both had too much history with the Athru to be able to put that all aside. She'd lost her husband because of the Athru. There was no way this wasn't motivated at least somewhat by anger and retribution. And that was no way to treat someone, except for the fact a third of the crew probably felt the same way. And Cass had to keep the peace on the ship, if nothing else. I agree with Samaya. Evie, please escort her to the brig until we can rule out her involvement in this. To his own amazement, he managed to not drop his gaze, though what he saw in Evie's eyes made him wish he had. You can't be serious. How are you planning on ruling her out? Evie's face was a mixture between indignation and anger. So? Cass asked. We will need to coordinate with Zenfor, check all of the scanning logs for the entire ship leading up to the incident. We'll also need to perform detailed scans of our guest herself, as soon as she is willing to allow them. Which will be never, Asterva said. Why are you so hesitant to be scanned? Hank asked. What are you hiding? My personal privacy, she replied. I will not say it again. But if you're willing to listen to his recklessness, she motioned toward Cass, then by all means, let us see how it works out for you. Evie, we're going to try and clear this up as quickly as possible. Cass took the captain's chair again, wanting this entire confrontation over with already. Though he did see satisfied looks on both Hank and Samaya's faces. I don't believe this, Evie said. Couldn't we just confine her to her quarters until the investigation is over? There are a number of devices and opportunities within each individual's quarters, which could potentially give them access to creating a homing signal, Saul said before Cass could answer. The brig is the only place on the ship completely cut off from any possible modification. Asterva shook her head, apparently disgusted with all of them. Evie looked like she might say something else, but instead she turned back to the hypervator, leading her mother back the way they'd come. Box stood off to the side, watching them. "Make sure they arrive okay," Cass said. Box nodded and got back into the hypervator with them. The look on Evie's face was one of palpable disgust, and yet Cass had made up his mind. This was the right call for the moment. If Asterva had anything to do with that ship attacking them, they needed to know. The hypervator doors closed, and the bridge seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Cass didn't look to anyone else for approval over what he'd done. He didn't need it. Even if Hank and Samaya hadn't brought it up, he would have considered restraining her. They had managed a week in Coalition space without running into any random patrols. The only time the Athru had found them had been when they'd been evacuating Starbase 5. While it was possible the ship had been nothing more than a random patrol, he didn't think it too likely, and it made Asterva's appearance back on Sisk more suspicious. Perhaps bringing her aboard had been the wrong call after all. They would find out soon enough. So, get started on the investigation. 17. The hypervator doors opened on level 9, and Evie stepped out ahead of the others, too mad to think straight. She'd managed to keep her calm at the bridge, but as they rode the carriage down, she'd only grown more and more upset at the current predicament. "Try not to be too angry with them. They are small and scared little creatures, and they need our pity," Asterva said. Evie hadn't realized she'd been that transparent. She thought she'd been holding her emotions in pretty well up until that point. "Weren't you the one who was just up there getting upset at them for the same thing? And don't call them small. Humans may not be equal to the Athru on the evolutionary scale, but that doesn't make them any less valuable." She hated Box had heard that. Now he was sure to report it back to Cass and the others, and it would only add fuel to the fire. "You're right. I'm sorry. It's just that I've spent a long time observing humans and not interacting with them. In some ways, I've come to think of myself as their protector, a guardian for those who are left. And yes, that includes everyone on this ship. I can't help but feel for their situation, even if it does lead me to being locked up. It won't be for long, I'm sure. The truth will bear out," Evie said. Part of the problem was she could see where Cass and the others were coming from. It was suspicious. Only a few hours after Asterva had come on board, they were attacked by an Athru ship. But coincidence did not prove anything, except maybe bad luck. And she trusted Zal to perform a thorough and impartial investigation. "We will see," Asterva replied. Her tone remained even, as it had been when they had been discussing Evie's conception. Oddly, the only thing she'd become agitated about thus far was the use of the transdimensional weapon. Evie couldn't say the same for herself. Listening to Asterva recount Evie's early history had seen her heart palpitating, and learning the answers she'd been seeking for so long, many of them only leading to more questions, was indescribable. It was almost like scratching an itch that had been plaguing her for years. "I'll stay with you," Evie said, "until you're released. At least you won't have to be alone." "That's very generous. Thank you," Asterva replied. They turned the corner, coming to a stop in front of the outer doors that led to the office outside the brig. The door slid open to reveal Vreed sitting at his desk, working on a screen in front of them. He glanced up, did a double take, then shot out of his seat, hopping over the desk and making a beeline for Asterva. "Vreed!" Evie yelled, but it was no use. His face was contorted in anger, pain, and his razor-sharp mandible had come out from his back and was pointed directly at Asterva's throat. Evie tried to move to intercept him, but realized too late she couldn't make it in time. He moved faster than she had ever seen, never taking his eyes off Asterva. Panic filled Evie immediately, and she yelled something inaudible to get him to stop. But before the blade could pierce her skin, Box was there in front of Asterva, blocking Vreej's way and holding his mandible off to the side with one hand and keeping Vreej at literal arm's length with the other. Evie hadn't even seen him move. "Holy shit, you're fast," Box said.
"Move out of my way, machine," Vreej yelled. "Vreej has vengeance to exact. Vreej, please."
Evie took hold of his shoulder. The contact seemed to get his attention, and he turned to her.
"She isn't like the others. She is my mother." "Mother?"
Vreej showed his teeth in a grimace.
"I'm sorry, but I can't." He paused. "Can't allow her to live. They destroyed my home."
"Not this one. She's helping us to defeat the rest of them," Evie said. She couldn't be sure, but she thought she felt Vreej relax under her grip.
"Box, let him go."
Box held on a few moments longer before allowing Vreej to step back. His mandible curled back on its joints, but remained out. Evie noticed it shook ever so slightly.
"If she's helping, why is she here, at the brig?"
"It's nothing more than a misunderstanding," Evie said. She turned to Box. "Would you please escort her into one of the cells inside while I finish speaking with our resident warden?" Box held his position for a beat, then turned to Asterva. "If you'll follow me, we have a variety of lavish accommodations. I'm sure you'll enjoy any one of them." He walked between them, with Asterva following along. For a moment, Evie thought Vreej might snap, and his mandible would slice Asterva across the neck. But he managed to hold his composure until they were in the next room.
"Misunderstanding?"
Vreej's eyes boring into Evie's. "We were just attacked by an Athru ship," she said. He slapped his chest twice.
"I saw the general alert. You pulled her off the ship that attacked us?"
"No. She came up from Sisk. She was waiting there for me. I've been looking for her all my life, and now I finally found her." Vreej glanced at the door separating his office from the cells.
"She is a liar. You cannot trust her."
"I have to," she replied. "She's the only person who can tell me about my past. She's already told me so much, and she's trying to help us destroy the rest of the Athru." At this, Vreej made a strange sound in his throat and produced a grin much too large to be natural.
"That is a good one. Cass has told me of jokes, and I enjoy the concept. A deliberate lie meant to amuse. I am amused."
"It's not a joke, Vreej. She doesn't believe in destroying other species like the rest of them. She wants to help us." The grin left his face.
"The Athru are ruthless killers. They will do anything to destroy us. This ship and its abilities upset them. That is why she is here."
He tapped his left cheek with his right hand. She wasn't sure what that meant, but she could guess. Add that to the fact he was reverting to his native sign language to communicate, meant he was close to losing it. "Why don't you take a break for a few minutes?" she suggested. "No one wanted to upset you. I just wasn't thinking about what bringing her here would do to you."
"I am not supposed to leave my post," he replied.
"Don't worry. I'll keep an eye on all of them until you get back." He squinted, his eyes darting back and forth.
"Well, I suppose you were the captain. I just need to clear my head. I can be better."
She smiled. "It's okay. We all need a break every now and then. And this is a stressful situation for all of us." Vreej took one last look at the door connecting the two spaces, then turned and left. Before Evie could even gather her thoughts, the opposite door opened, and Box stepped out. "She's secure in there. I figured you didn't want her in with the rabble, so I put her in her own cell." Evie mentally stumbled for a moment. And then she remembered. The Space Wing pilots who had helped Raffenkill were still in the brig as well. With so much going on, she'd forgotten they were even in there. Perhaps promising to stay with Asterva wasn't a good idea after all. She would be subjecting herself to a lot of abuse. "Something wrong?" Box asked. She shook her head. "It's been a weird day." "I'll say," he replied. "Learning that you were grown in only 7 weeks. and we never had any indication from your medical scans. These Athru do some good work, let me tell you. But I think what is more impressive is the fact you don't have any of their physical traits. No one would even know you weren't human." Yes, she'd been meaning to ask about that. But she also found it interesting the Athru couldn't conceive children naturally anymore. Were they so advanced they'd eliminated the need for that trait? She'd never heard of anything like it before. And it opened up a potential weakness in their society. If all their children were grown outside their mothers' bodies, all they would have to do was deny the Athru that technology to halt the expansion of their species. It wasn't much to go on, but at least now Evie had a starting point. Though it was buried deep, her desire to know more about her own personal history eclipsed the need to find a way to stop the Athru. She wasn't sure why she was so urgent about it, but she felt if she didn't learn these things now, she might never know. She'd been given an amazing opportunity, and she wasn't going to waste it. "I hate to ask, but I'd like another DNA sample from you, if you have a second," Bach said, one of his fingers opening to reveal a syringe. "I'd like to perform some deeper analysis on it, now that we know what we're looking for." "Maybe later," Evie said, staring at the door. She hoped this investigation didn't take long. She couldn't afford to wait to find the answers to her questions, and she didn't want the other prisoners to overhear. She glanced over at Boggs, who had retracted the needle, but he was slumped over. "Very well. When you have the time, I suppose." He turned and left her alone to the Briggs office. She could worry about Boggs later. Right now, her destiny was on the other side of that door. She took a deep breath and stepped through, and no sooner had she passed the threshold did the jeers and boos begin from the prisoners. "Traitor! Collaborator! Murderer!" Evie didn't look at them, instead walked straight past to the cell where Boggs had placed her mother. She sat serenely on the small shelf in the room, her hands folded in her lap. "Don't kid yourself, Captain," Squire said. "You belong in here more than any of us." "Are you all right?" Evie asked. Asterva nodded. "What was their crime?" she asked, indicating the people in the other cell. "Trying to save the Coalition," Linkovich said, "by preventing a murderer from taking over the ship." "Oh, you mean Caspian," Asterva said. Linkovich furrowed his brow. "No, I meant... After all, Caspian was the one who started all of this. He's the reason the Athru decimated the entire Coalition. I heartily agree. He should be removed from command and imprisoned." Linkovich was struck silent, a confused look on his face. "I really wish you'd lay off Cass. He's doing the best he can with a difficult situation," Evie said. "Yes, and he's terrible at it. Can't you see that? Even before the Athru managed to make it to Coalition space, we knew it wouldn't survive. And we knew it was because one man had single-handedly put a stop to a mission that might have given the Coalition an edge in their oncoming fight." Evie eyed her. "He had no idea this kind of threat was coming." "He should have." "Do you think my people have survived as long as they have by being passive? By being complacent, that just because no one has challenged their authority yet, outside a few minor skirmishes, that it will never happen? The Sill didn't do you any favors when they decided not to engage in a full-scale war 100 years ago. Had you survived, at least you would have been better prepared." Evie scoffed. "Yeah, right. Not even the Athru can stand up to the advanced technology of the Sill. How were we supposed to survive a war?" Asterva shrugged. Many jeers came from the other cell. Evie's patience was wearing thin. She was already second-guessing her decision to stay in here with Asterva until the investigation was over. What if it took more than a day? "Locking us up like animals, when there's only one killer in this room, and she's the only person free," Iavaron said, to the agreement of the others. "That's not technically true," Asterva said, standing and addressing the group. She walked up to the edge of the force barrier and stopped. "I am also a killer."
Just a few hours ago on the planet, I dispatched with a person who probably didn't deserve death. But it was necessary in order for me to survive. My daughter has done no less. The fact it was an illusion was not her fault.
Wait, you're her mother? Athru asked. How?
It was a very complex process involving time and genetic manipulation. But if you'd like a detailed description, I'd be happy to.
So, not only are you a killer, Athru said, staring at Evie, but you're one of them. How do we know you haven't been a plant this entire time?
Because if she had been, she wouldn't have waited this long to kill every last one of you, Asterva replied. The Athru don't waste time with subterfuge. We get right to the point.
Athru stepped back, shock on his face. Evie gritted her teeth. She hated Asterva had to be in here with them, but she could handle herself. Wasn't Jan supposed to be working on more permanent accommodations for the pilots? They were her people, after all. At least all but Ryder, who had stayed in the back of the cell, his legs and arms crossed, looking down. Evie needed to follow back up with Saturina. Even if the investigation was wrapped up quickly, Evie didn't like the idea of them spending much more time cramped in that cell. It wasn't humane. She turned her attention back to Asterva.
I have something I need to do, but I'll be back.
Her mother nodded.
I understand.
As Evie turned to leave, she heard one of the pilots utter something under their breath. But instead of taking the bait, she just kept on walking.